All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us on this post Blue Angels Day. I hope everybody had a good commissioning week so far. If you participated in the commissioning week activities, we had a cruise on Tuesday and beautiful weather for the chamber, and then got to go to the Naval Academy yesterday and watch it from Hospital Point. So that was fun. So now we're gloomy and cold and rainy, and hopefully that will change before the Memorial Day weekend. But so happy to have Hannah Allen with the Maryland State Chamber here with us. So here at the Chamber, I'm Amy, the President and CEO of the Arundel Chamber of Commerce. So one of our important things that we do is advocate and provide information for our members. And so we have the privilege of being a partner with the Maryland State Chamber through their Federation program. And they have been our awesome boots on the ground, working hard in the General Assembly this season. So what we're gonna let her kind of turn it over to Hannah to talk about what happened, what didn't happen, and a lot of probably what's going to happen in the future next year. So with that, I will pass it over to Hannah.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Again, Hannah Allen with the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. I'm on the government affairs team here. So I do all things advocacy and lobbying for the chamber. And I do, Amy mentioned the Chamber Federation that we have, where a lot of local chambers of commerce and other statewide associations like the Tech Council and Cybersecurity Association are members through the Federation. And it's a really great group, and we appreciate your chamber's participation in it. It helps us as a state chamber have better reach into small business issues, right? Because you all have a lot better coverage of what is happening in the county that you represent. So we appreciate the partnership there. I just want to kind of cover some of the bigger issues that stood out during the 2026 legislative session. And it really mostly focusing on business community impacts, since that's what drives a lot of our focus and work at the chamber. And I feel like, I always point to revenue and the budget first, because that's really what is top of mind for the administration and for legislators in Annapolis. This session, the governor introduced his budget, and the House and Senate, as always, made changes that they wanted to make to it. But at the end of the day, they signed an almost $71 billion budget into law last month, which the Constitution requires that they pass a balanced budget every year. We heard this a lot this year, but the budget does not include any new taxes or fees. It is, an election year. It is common in election years for the governor and legislators to not propose or pass new taxes and fees, since they frankly aren't popular among voters, right? So going into session, we kind of knew what to expect when it came to revenue raiser proposals, just given kind of the election year dynamics at play. And then I think right before the session, right, it was forecasted that the state would have a $1.5 billion gap between expenses and actual revenue coming in. Again, the Constitution requires that they pass a balanced budget, and they did. They were able to close that gap by moving money around and making some cuts between the Democrats and the Republicans. We saw a lot of differing reactions to the budget. At the end of the day, Republicans saying that nothing was done to stimulate the economy and provide real relief to Marylanders and address the growing budget deficits in future years and out years. And then, of course, the Democrats saying that they were able to pass a balanced budget without raising any new taxes or fees. So that was kind of the differing opinions on how we ended up with the budget. But for fiscal year 28, which begins July 1st of 2027, I think the projections are a $3 billion structural budget deficit, which will likely, I think, get up to $4 billion by fiscal year 2030. So, my takeaway is that while it's great that we didn't see new taxes this year, we also didn't set ourselves up to address the growing gap in spending and revenues for next session and beyond. I do expect that we'll see a lot of revenue raiser proposals during the 2027 session, once the election is behind us as well. And then, outside of the budget, I'll note that a study bill did pass this session, which was a Maryland Association of Counties and Maryland Municipal League priority. It was House Bill 1142. This sets up the task force to modernize county and municipal revenue structures, to study the revenue structure of county and municipal governments. So the task force has to submit a report of their findings and recommendations by December 1st of this year. We see lots of efforts every session for local governments to have more taxing authority, but those bills typically don't really go anywhere. Counties, rely pretty heavily on property taxes and mostly abide by state-defined tax systems. And I think they're feeling more and more pressure from spending requirements and the state shifting spending onto localities like the Blueprint, the big education reform program that Maryland passed a number of years ago. So this was their effort to work towards more flexibility through this task force and study and recommendations that are due at the end of the year. So we will be interested to see what the report recommends, because it's likely that legislation could be pulled from that report for next session as a result of whatever they're recommending. From our standpoint, right, we typically aren't generally supportive of proposals for locals to create their own special taxes. We dealt with some bills this year. We've dealt with bills in the past that would create special taxes on commercial property at the local level in certain counties, right? We don't want to see a patchwork approach in Maryland of businesses who operate in multiple counties having to comply with different standards. So that's generally been our standpoint, which is why I think we're interested. We didn't have a position on this study bill, but we are interested to kind of see what comes of it and what the legislature may find is worth pooling into different bills. So that's kind of high level where we were on all things revenue and taxes. The other big topic that took up a lot of focus this session was energy. House and Senate Democratic leadership introduced the Utility Relief Act with the goal of lowering utility bills for residents. This ended up being the largest and most comprehensive energy bill passed this session at a very high level. The bill is doing a few different things. It's providing short-term relief to ratepayers through a credit of around, I think it's $150 a year, which is also popular among voters in an election year. But the bill also put new oversight and accountability provisions on utility companies, like around how rates are set and what costs can and cannot be passed on to consumers. And then on the data center piece in that bill, there was a pretty, I guess outside of that bill first, there was a pretty big amount of legislative activity that we saw this session and last session on data centers. There were over a dozen bills introduced that would have restricted or even paused data center development in Maryland. There were proposals for a statewide moratorium, new taxes on data centers, and pretty strict energy and environmental mandates. Ultimately, none of the standalone bills passed. Instead, we saw data center policy folded into that bigger Utility Relief Act energy bill. The bill includes new confidential reporting requirements for large energy users like data centers. There is a voluntary clean energy program where data centers and other large energy users could choose to meet a portion of their energy needs through new generation or storage and exchange, for potential permitting benefits from the state. So, I think broadly speaking, the Utility Relief Act preserves the ability for data center development in Maryland. But I think we are still somewhat of a challenging state. We have an ever-changing environment for data centers, like many other states who are reacting in real time to kind of the boom that we're seeing in data center development. So that was the Utility Relief Act. And then pivoting a little from energy into the environmental space, there was a bill that I spent a lot of time on at the chamber, and so did a number of other businesses throughout the state and associations, which was the Cherish Act. Again, at a high level, the Cherish Act was designed to address concerns around cumulative environmental and public health impacts from certain types of businesses and communities that are considered environmental justice areas or overburdened and underserved communities. Look, I think the intent behind the bill was to make sure that vulnerable communities are not disproportionately impacted by pollution or industrial activity. The bill is written. What the bill would have done is substantially change the state's permitting process for really a wide range of projects that we see. This included everything from energy infrastructure and manufacturing facilities to waste management operations, large commercial developments. I think the list goes on the types of businesses and projects it could impact, but there were added requirements for existing and new facilities in these EJ areas, where that if a project is determined to contribute to a negative cumulative environmental or public health impact in one of these communities, the state would be required to deny the permit. There are lots of other kind of nuances within that bill, but the chamber's concerns were that it really focused on the lack, there was a lack of clarity in the permitting process that we saw in the bill text itself. It had a pretty broad application across really important industries to the state. And the risk that we saw is that it would shift permitting towards denial in certain areas. And we were concerned that the bill would create uncertainty for, investment in the state and limit economic development at the end of the day, especially in areas it aimed to support. So that was our standpoint. We certainly support the goal it was trying to address, but we did not feel like the bill was going to be beneficial for the economy. The bill did not pass. I do expect it to come back next year. If you take a look at the Maryland Department of the Environment, they have an EJ permitting or an EJ map on their website, which, you can see the state as a whole. You can zoom in on specific areas. But there were certainly areas in Anne Arundel County that would have been impacted, especially around the airport, Linthicum area, areas south of Baltimore, the Fort Meade area. I'm sure permitting issues is something that many businesses and members of the Anne Arundel Chamber care about. So I just think this is something to be aware of as efforts kind of evolve in future legislative sessions. And then kind of talking about the economy, I'll talk about the Governor's Decade Act, which did pass this year. That was a bill that we did support. The governor's focus in that bill was to strengthen the state's ability to attract and grow businesses by removing some barriers to investment and kind of realigning the state's economic development tools. On the tax credits and incentives piece of the bill, it's renewing and in some cases expanding programs like the R&D tax credit, which we were supportive of since many, life sciences and tech and biotech companies and other really innovation-driven industries utilize that quite a bit. It did also extend the Build Our Future grant program, which provides matching grants to increase construction of certain infrastructure for high growth sectors. I think taking a step back and thinking about why we supported it, Maryland is struggling with domestic outmigration. I think we rank 45th nationally in the number of residents that we lose to other states. And we think that by focusing on and extending the most valuable tools in the state's toolbox, it could hopefully help mitigate some of the issues that we're seeing when it comes to domestic outmigration. But I think to really address people moving out of Maryland, right, we would need to look at a lot of other things along with that, like the cost of living and housing and taxes. So we thought that this bill was a step in the right direction. We were happy to support it. And then reminds me of a job fair bill that we introduced, which would have created the Workforce Opportunities Grant Program to provide grants to organizations to help them stand up job fairs and workforce events. This kind of bill idea stemmed from a lot of success that we had during the interim. So really during kind of the spring, summer, and fall in 2025, where we partnered with a few local workforce organizations to stand up job fairs, and they were a huge success. We got a lot of private businesses involved, and both businesses and policymakers that represented those districts were really excited about the idea of making it a bigger effort. So that bill did move this session. It crossed over to the opposite chamber, but it did not pass in the time left of the legislative session this year. So it's something we would like to work on again in the future. So I just wanted to kind of mention that we'll probably be back with trying to do something around incentivizing job fairs and workforce opportunities throughout the state. And then on the housing piece, there was a strong push this year around housing production and development certainty. Recognizing that workforce growth and economic development are closely tied to housing availability. The governor's transit-oriented development bill and his Housing Certainty Act were both really, I think, aimed at accelerating housing production. But I think they took different approaches there. The Housing Certainty Act, which did pass, provides developers with more predictability in the process by establishing vesting rights, meaning projects are governed by the rules in place when an application is submitted, and delays. The bill also delayed certain local fees to help reduce the upfront cost to developers. From a developer standpoint, this is reducing regulatory risk and increasing certainty, thus incentivizing them to want to develop and invest in areas throughout the state. And then the transit-oriented development bill was intended to spur housing near major transit by easing local zoning restrictions, doing things like encouraging mixed-use development and providing some financial incentives as well. That bill did also pass. So I think together those two bills, those proposals reflect kind of a broader push to try and increase the state's housing supply while helping lower costs a little bit and hopefully streamlining development, especially in some high demand areas throughout the state. So that's kind of where we ended up on the housing front. We typically we've gotten a little bit more involved in housing this year, which I think is exciting. It's a kind of a big policy issue and a lot plays into the housing front. So we were happy to get more engaged there. And then trying to think of other kind of big level. I'll talk a little bit about labor and employment because that affects small businesses. So minimum wage, we saw a lot of efforts this session, as we typically see, to increase the state's minimum wage, which is currently at $15 an hour. There was a bill to increase it to $18 an hour. And then there was a bill to increase it to $25 an hour. So two different proposals this session. Usually we typically just see one. Neither of them passed, but I think it's kind of reflective of some legislators, feel that the cost of living, the cost of childcare, housing affordability, all those things is not keeping pace with minimum wage. At the state chamber, we have generally been opposed to hikes in minimum wage, especially something as high as $25 an hour from our current $15 an hour. Generally, we are in line with our neighboring states, right? And at the chamber, we think a lot about competitiveness and where our neighboring states are and how we can remain competitive with them, especially Virginia, who ranks really well in a lot of important business metrics. I think DC is the only jurisdiction neighboring to us that is higher at the moment. So that's what we saw in minimum wage. I would expect there would continue to be efforts to increase the state's minimum wage next session. So expect that to be back. And I know we do a lot of work with our chamber federation members, like the Arundel County Chamber, around some of these efforts that do impact small business. And then unemployment insurance is another big one that you may not often think about, but every business with at least one employee pays unemployment insurance taxes to the state. And I think it's important to note that it has been quite a while since we have seen increases in employer UI taxes. And it's also been a little, I think a little over a decade since we've seen increases in the amount that people who are unemployed and collecting unemployment benefits are receiving. So we did see efforts this session. We have seen them in past sessions to increase the amount of unemployment insurance taxes. Is we want to make sure that, or the state wants to make sure that the trust fund remains solvent, especially if we see another economic downturn. I think COVID really kind of raised the flags on the importance of making sure that the state remains solvent for unemployment insurance. Right now they are solvent and the trust fund is generally healthy, but there are projections in future years that it could get to a place that's concerning. So that's kind of why we've seen that effort. I think we are cognizant of that it has been quite a while since UI taxes have been raised, but we also want to make sure it's done in a way that isn't too much of an increase and a high jump on employers, and that we're also encouraging the workforce to get back to work and not, there's a fine balance of how much people collecting unemployment benefits will make. If it's too high, it could encourage them to just stay on unemployment and not get serious about returning to the workforce. So that was another kind of big issue that we've dealt with. And then I will also mention the Maryland Worker Freedom Act. The governor did sign this into law. This is also commonly called captive audience legislation. A few other states have passed this, but the bill prohibits employers from disciplining or firing or retaliating against employees who refuse to attend employer-sponsored meetings about political or religious beliefs, or religious matters. This includes, unionization. Employers can still hold the meetings, but attendance has to be voluntary. I think the big issue is that the bill went far beyond unionization efforts and discussions and extended to meetings about proposals to change legislation or regulations or related to public policy discussions. So ordinary employer communications about issues that directly affect the business and the employees, like, energy regulations or taxes or workplace mandates, are looped in through the language in the bill. So, that was something that we were certainly concerned about. The bill still did pass as written. There could be efforts to challenge this in court. We saw, we've seen in Connecticut and California and Minnesota, other states that have passed this law, they've all been challenged. So potentially more to come on that. I just think it's something, since it does really impact employers more broadly, it's something to be aware of, that was focused on this session. So I think overall, right, I'd say the word to describe the focus of this session was affordability. Passing a balanced budget with no new taxes, I think, shaped major policy decisions. Anything that would have resulted in reduced money going into the budget, like a new tax incentive or cutting taxes, did not go anywhere because, again, the state needs money. And any bill that had a fiscal note tacked onto it, especially a larger fiscal note, really didn't get much attention this year. I think Maryland's economy has been pretty heavily tied to the federal government, but the state has been dealing with the loss of tens of thousands of federal jobs, which I think has increased the urgency around, diversifying the state's economy. So things like we have federal government and contractors, heavily located in Maryland. We have major universities and research institutions here, right? We have great healthcare and life sciences in the state. We have great innovation-driven sectors like biotech and aerospace and IT. These are areas where the state is trying to grow as well. So we have seen more of a focus around economic diversification, and the governor really kind of focusing on that and growing those innovation-driven sectors, which I think we've seen from some proposals he's introduced and policies he's moved forward with at the state level. I'll quickly mention this. This is not an issue that the chamber really touches. I'll quickly mention immigration. This was a really big focus this session. You probably saw it in the news a lot. We saw bills like banning ICE 287G agreements introduced, banning, private detention centers that passed to limit state and local involvement with ICE. Again, not an issue that the chamber gets involved in, but it is a very contentious issue. And we did see a lot of focus and legislation specific to that topic this session. But I think taking a step back, at the end of the day, the chamber made out pretty well. Only 3 bills that we opposed ended up passing. And some of the more controversial issues like taxes were very tame this session, just kind of given, again, the election year dynamics, which was expected. I think there were around 2,600 bills introduced this session, and I think 887 of them passed. So looking ahead, we're really gearing up for a tough 2027 legislative session. We also plan to see a lot of new faces in the General Assembly after the election. I think there's 25 legislators that are either retiring or running for higher office. So with, new and fresh faces in the legislature comes, more opportunity to build new relationships and educate them on issues that impact the business community and the economy in the state. And then I'll also just quickly plug, Amy, our 2026 competitiveness index book. This was it's on our website now, but it includes over 150 different metrics measuring kind of where Maryland ranks compared to all of the neighboring states on, excuse me, not neighboring states, all of the other states in the country on things like taxes, population trends, research and development spending, commuting times. Like it really touches every kind of sector. It's showing kind of what direction Maryland is headed based on past data as well. So that's been really helpful. We've made sure that legislators have those books in hand and they've been referenced quite a bit. So I think it's just kind of helpful. It's just, nonpartisan data that you can reference to see what are areas where Maryland's doing really well and what are areas where Maryland needs to do better in. And that's kind of what has driven our focus advocacy wise and legislative wise from the state chamber level. We want to focus on things like the cost of doing business, where we rank 46th, and we're 37th in business friendliness. So we want to focus on things like permitting and regulatory reform and business taxes, like all that stuff plays into these overall rankings. I think that mostly sums everything up. Amy, I can turn it back over to you. I'll just quickly mention, we come out every year with a head of session in the fall with legislative priorities based on, member discussions that we have with our members. Typically, they generally kind of remain the same, but change a little bit year to year, depending on what the focus is on. Again, business taxes is kind of remains highest level, what our members and businesses throughout the state really care about. How are we going to balance the state's budget? How is the state going to find new revenue? Are they going to raise taxes? What are we going to see there? So that's a huge focus on our end. I would expect that to continue to be something we spend the most time on going into 2027. I didn't really talk about transportation too much outside of transit-oriented development, but transportation funding solutions is really important, right? We see investment in our roads and bridges and transit systems as a means for people to commute to and from work as quickly as possible and safely as possible. And we need to make sure that businesses can move their services and goods as quickly and efficiently as possible throughout the state. We have a lot of we're seeing deficits in the state's transportation trust fund. So that's been a focus that members have really raised and that we've spent some time on this session and in past sessions. But the state pretty much needs to find a replacement to the gas tax, which is dwindling because of, vehicle electrification and vehicles just becoming more fuel efficient in general. So that's kind of an effort that you'll see some legislators focus on who are in those Environment and Transportation Committee that care a lot about and work on transportation issues. So that's something that I think that we'll continue to focus on. And then just general like AI and data privacy stuff that will continue, I think, to be a focus of ours. The state doesn't have a broad AI regulatory framework at this point. We do have a data privacy one, but not an AI one. So I think there's going to continue to be a focus on how the state uses AI, how businesses use AI, how school systems use AI with hyper-specific bills, and then maybe more broad bills. So I think that issue will come back next session as well. And then on workforce, right? I talked about job fairs a little bit. Childcare also has been pretty important to us. We want to make sure that people and workers and families have access to affordable and reliable childcare options. Childcare is very expensive. I had a baby 10 months ago, and we are paying for childcare now. And now that I can actually experience it and live it, it's certainly something that I've become more passionate about. Is hopefully helping our legislators in the state try to find solutions to the childcare crisis that we're in. And I think I'll stop there. There's so much that I could talk about, but I think that's a pretty good overview of the high level stuff that businesses could have been are impacted by, both good and bad, and then a kind of where we're headed for next session. So Amy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. As you can tell, she is a wealth of knowledge and information. So does anybody have any questions for Hannah while we have her attention on anything she discussed? just unmute and ask if you do. No one?
If
She
there's no
covered
question,
it all?
I'm going to say if
One
there's no
thing, I'll ask, that I didn't know if you touched on that I think you guys discussed was the deficit from the tech tax that we saw last year. They had budgeted to bring in a lot more revenue from that tech tax than actually came in. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. So last year, again, budget deficit, they had to come up with new revenue raisers, right? New sources of revenue to help fill the deficit in the state's budget. Um, the tech tax, which is on data, IT software services.
Our
Um,
Zoom, we pay
that
now an extra tax on our Zoom subscription.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. Yep. So that 3% tax was passed. And, I'll say, stepping back, there was a broader business to business services tax that was introduced, 2.5% on, services that are B2B, not B2C. So that was introduced as a very broad bill, would have raised a ton of money for the state's budget. But at the end of the day, with a lot of help from the Federation, from you all, and from many other county and local chambers, we fought that proposal back. I mean, there were hundreds of people that came to testify against that broader bill that would have placed a lot of new tax burden on business to business services. That was fought back, and instead the legislature passed what we call the tech tax on software, data, IT services. So that did pass at 3%. Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that the revenue they were projected to receive from that tax has not been realized at a significant level. So now we're kind of looking forward, and we did get some changes, very specific changes to like multiple points of use, very technical stuff, that we were able to get some wins on this session, that some legislators, some Democrat legislators sponsored for us, which was great. So we're seeing kind of both sides of the aisle come together and say, hey, this has caused a huge issue in Maryland. There's tons of companies, especially in like the contractor, subcontractor defense space, that are impacted by this. Some companies have already left the state. Some have substantially changed operations because of this tax, and now we're not realizing the revenue that we were expecting to see. So yes, Amy, long-winded answer is that was a problem. It still is a problem. Hopefully there will be more meaningful changes. We'd love to see a repeal of that. But that means that they'll have to figure out another revenue source to cover the little revenue it's bringing in, right?
Do you think they will try to bring back the B2B business tax
Oh
in a
yeah,
different
yeah.
form?
I really think everything's on the table. I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly would expect to see that brought back. Could be narrowed at maybe less B2B services potentially. But yeah, I would expect that to be back. I think they're really gonna put everything on the table for discussion, and we'll see what ends up happening at the end of the day next session.
Mhm. Do you also foresee, we did a webinar with some of our HR and attorney professionals on contracting W-2 employees versus 1099 and making sure that businesses are compliant, that the Department of Labor is probably going to start cracking down on compliance to try and help get that revenue and slap a bunch of fees and penalties on businesses. Do you
Yeah,
foresee that happening?
we saw not this past session, the session before, the attorney general had a bill on workplace fraud, but it was really expanding to a lot of different industries. Right now, it's construction and landscaping is the focus of who that covers in the state. Um, so so that bill did not pass, but that kind of spurred, I think there's always effort, right, on addressing workplace fraud. The Department of Labor has the Joint Enforcement Task Force, JETF, that came out with a report somewhat recently, with recommendations on how to tighten up, workplace fraud issues and 1099 versus W-2s. Um, I think from that report, we saw legislation introduced by the Maryland Department of Labor this session, that would have placed, more fines and penalties on employers. It did not expand the coverage of the current, who it covers which is construction and landscaping, like we saw 2 years ago. The bill was very close to passing, but did not pass, and was amended pretty heavily. That was something that we spent a lot of time on. But I would fully expect a focus on workplace fraud to be back next session for sure.
And it has, we mentioned earlier in the call, being a part of the federation. So our members that are 10 employees and under, right? 10 and under,
Mhm.
are
Yep.
also a part of the Federation in the Maryland State Chamber of Commerce. So you guys we were kind of in the middle of it this year, but next year you'll really start getting communications directly from them with the request to testify. And so just wanted to give a plug for that and how much that means to them and how they get tired of seeing Hannah and Grayson argue. And they know when they come in, they know they're going to argue and fight something. But it means a lot to have the small business owners there and testifying and representative. I think that was a big part of the minimum wage push, having the waiter,
Yep.
especially with the tip credit.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amy. I think we're very active, right, at the state chamber as the lobbyists, for the state chamber and fighting back proposals and also supporting good proposals that help businesses in the economy. We do both. We try to find as many bills we can support as possible, but we do often find that we are opposing a much larger number of bills. But at the end of the day, like legislators tell us all the time that it's important for the business community to show up on bills that would impact them. And I know for a small business it can be a lot to step away for a half day, because you really do have to commit to after lunchtime to just being in Annapolis. But hopefully with your members, with the location of you in Arundel, very close to the Capitol, in the Capitol. So we would certainly appreciate engagement from businesses, small businesses, medium-sized, large businesses of all industries who are impacted by legislation to come to Annapolis or submit written testimony if you can't come to Annapolis. We did create a toolkit, I think 2 sessions ago, with very detailed information on like how to navigate the General Assembly website and testify and sign up and write testimony, all that good stuff. Yeah, so that should be included in everything that you all receive from us.
Yeah, even the written ones were super easy. You just plug in your name, information,
Yeah,
hit send, and it goes right to your elected officials. So
thanks, Amy.
awesome. Is there anything, Hannah, like that else besides that we can be doing as a chamber and with our small business owners, just like in this interim as you're preparing for the next session and everything that is gonna get thrown out there that can help you guys prep for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 things. I think, engaging with your delegation, your elected officials is very helpful. We're focused on state advocacy, state legislation. So that's generally what we focus on. So I know that you also probably engage with your, the county council and county executive's office, which is great. But making sure that you're engaging with your state elected officials is really helpful, whether it's setting up monthly meetings or whatever it is, to touch base on issues that your members care about. I think I don't know exactly how your legislative committee and you kind of handle polling of issues and stuff like that for members, but it just talking with us about the issues that you all are most concerned about, for boots on the ground issues, is really helpful as we kind of frame what our kind of legislative agenda is going to look like too. And we're happy to continue to be a resource on whatever policy issue it is. I know chambers, businesses are impacted by tons of different policy issues. We're here to be a resource as issues crop up.
Awesome. It actually is our time to do our survey, and that was a big piece of it from our legislative committee is
Okay.
to do that. So
Yep.
we'll hopefully have some good intel for you in the coming months.
Good. Awesome. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Thank you all for being here, and I hope everybody has a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.